I want to introduce myself. Well, actually, I'll introduce myself again for those who haven't been here. My name is Alejandro Alvarez Acuna. I'm a Costa Rican student studying international relations at Tufts, and I'm part of the student organizing committee. And I would like to welcome you guys to this panel, which we will explore a critical and rather timely question: is democracy a fixed ideal, or is it a fluid concept susceptible to manipulation and interpretation? Traditionally, as you might know, democracy has been upheld as a system embodying values such as free and fair elections, the rule of law, protection of human rights, and the separation of power. There are several instances around the world created to evaluate the conditions of states in terms of democracy, like, for example, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, ranging from the full democracies to authoritarian regimes. However, in our current global landscape, it's clear that we're observing a shifting trend. The term democracy is increasingly used as a veneer to legitimize actions that contradict its very foundational principles. Consider, for instance, nations labeled as democracies by some instances and non-democracies by others. For example, say Bhutan. The Democracy Dictatorship Index classifies Bhutan as a democracy since 2007, following its transition to a constitutional monarchy. In contrast, the Bois-Miller-Rosato Index did not recognize Bhutan as a democracy until 2015. And so this 8-year discrepancy raises questions about the benchmarks used to define democratic status. As such, the concept of democracy exists on a continuum, ranging from minimal or procedural democracy to maximal or sustained democracy. This spectrum challenges to critically assess not just whether democracy or democratic institutions are in place, but how they function in practice. To introduce this complexity, consider a rather recent event. US President Donald Trump labeled just a few days ago Ukraine, under President Volodymyr Zelensky, a dictatorship without elections, accusing him of prolonging the conflict with Russia for personal gain. This not only starkly contrasts with the widespread perception of Ukraine as a nation striving to uphold democratic values amidst external aggression, but also prompts us for a deeper examination of how democratic labels can be contested or politicized. This malleability of the term democracy and how it can be weaponized to serve divergent narratives is precisely what brings us here. It compels us to raise the question: who defines what constitutes democracy? What standards are applied? And who holds the authority to enforce them? And when a state is designed or designated as a democracy, does it gain a carte blanche to act in the name of democracy, irrespective of the ethical implications? To navigate these complexities, we're honored to have with us 5 distinguished panelists. What I'll do is I'll introduce each one of them, and then I'll give them the floor so they can present themselves. So first we have Professor Ali Barakovsky, a faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, whose expertise includes international relations and comparative politics, with a focus on the dynamics of democratic transitions and the impact of globalization on governance structures.
Great, thank you. Is the microphone on? I assume you all can hear me. It is on. Okay, very good. Well, I didn't know I would be going first, but let me start by saying that I'm delighted to participate in this conference on the state of democracy worldwide. I'd like to thank everyone involved in the planning of this timely and very important event. I began collaborating with Tufts IGL more than a decade ago through the EPIC Colloquium and Symposium, and I was pleased to be invited today to speak on why democracy failed in Russia, so that will be our first case study, and what lessons that might hold for democracies around the world, including the United States. I think Russia's contemporary history in many ways embodies the idea of democracy as a continuum. It's a cautionary tale of the fragility of democracy. So in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with that came the hope that Russia might emerge as a democratic state. The early 1990s were a time of both promise and uncertainty. Russia adopted a new constitution, held multi-party elections, and experienced a brief period of free media and political pluralism. Yet, within several decades, these democratic aspirations were extinguished, and today Russia stands as a fully consolidated authoritarian regime where dissent is crushed, elections are manipulated, corruption is ubiquitous, the rule of law is subordinated entirely to the Kremlin, and power is concentrated essentially in the hands of one person, Vladimir Putin. Russia's path from the Soviet collapse to today's authoritarian system was shaped by a series of critical junctures where democracy might have taken root, but was instead systematically weakened. In chronological order, I will try to assess 7 key turning points and use them to highlight the mechanisms through which authoritarianism consolidates over time, revealing a pattern of power centralization, institutional erosion, and societal control. So first, in 1993, Russia faced its first major constitutional crisis. President Boris Yeltsin clashed with the hardline legislature, the Supreme Soviet, over economic reforms and executive authority. The standoff escalated until Yeltsin ordered the military to shell the parliament building, the White House, in a dramatic show of force. The result was a new constitution that vastly expanded the presidential power. Under this system, the Russian president had near total control over the government, the ability to rule by decree, and a weakened legislative and judicial system. This hyper-presidential structure, often called a super-presidency, created a political imbalance that Putin would later exploit. So the first lesson is, the over-concentration of power in the executive weakens democratic institutions. Once an imbalance is created, it is difficult to reverse, as it allows future leaders to consolidate power further without meaningful checks and balances. Well, we've seen that in many places around the world. Second, by the mid-1990s, Russia's experiment with democracy was already faltering. The 1996 presidential election, a pivotal moment in Russian political history, was marred by elite manipulation and media control. Yeltsin, who was deeply unpopular due to the economic turmoil at the time and the First Chechen War, was polling in the single digits against Communist Party challenger Gennady Zyuganov. Fearing a return to Soviet-style governance, Russia's newly empowered oligarchs, with strong support from Western governments, poured money into Yeltsin's campaign and ensured favorable media coverage. The election was won, but at a significant cost. It eroded trust in democratic processes, as many Russians saw it as rigged in favor of the elites. The event entrenched oligarchic control and state capture over Russian politics. Wealthy business elites who had acquired vast industries through the controversial process of privatization became kingmakers in the new Russia, ensuring that the political system served their interests rather than those of the broader population. That blurred the line between political power and economic wealth, undermining the legitimacy of Russia's democracy and creating the basis for what gradually became authoritarian kleptocracy, in which political power and economic wealth became tightly fused. So the second lesson is, when elections are manipulated, whether through media control, financial influence, or outright fraud, public faith in democracy weakens. A system dominated by elite interests rather than genuine political competition is prone to long-term instability. Third, on December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin resigned unexpectedly, handing power to his recent appointed Prime Minister, Putin. Initially an obscure figure, Putin quickly solidified his rule through a combination of rule of law rhetoric, where we heard that before, media control, and military action in Chechnya, the Second Chechen War. His first presidential election in 2000 was technically competitive, but with state-controlled television framing him as Russia's only hope for stability, his victory was all but assured. Russia's first several years of Putin's rule saw the dismantling of its fragile democratic institutions. That included media control. The last independent television networks were brought under Kremlin control. By 2003, all the major broadcasters were either state-owned or run by Kremlin-aligned business interests. There was the federal power vertical, where governors were stripped of their autonomy and direct gubernatorial elections were abolished, effectively turning regional leaders into Kremlin appointees. And finally, the oligarchs were brought to heel. While Yeltsin was beholden to the oligarchs, Putin reversed the power dynamic. Business elites were given an ultimatum: either stay out of politics or face destruction. The arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of Russia's richest men, in 2003 served as a stark warning to all the other oligarchs. The Kremlin gradually transferred political power and economic wealth from the oligarchs to the so-called silviki, literally in Russian, people of force or strongmen, led by the security services, who built elaborate patronage networks overpowering formal institutions. That allowed Putin to transform Russia's political system from a weak democracy into what some scholars call competitive authoritarianism, or electoral authoritarianism, if you will, a system where elections still happen and competition among political parties still exists, but are manipulated to ensure regime survival. Putin's rule initially relied more on carefully engineered popular consent and what some scholars have called a non-participation pact with society than outright mass repression, which gave a kind of veneer of pluralism. So the third lesson is, once a leader consolidates media, economic, and political control, democracy becomes increasingly difficult to restore. The transition from weak democracy to soft authoritarianism, or what some scholars call a hybrid regime, or a semi-authoritarian regime, can happen very quickly, especially if opposition forces are unable to organize effectively. Fourth, for much of Putin's rule, overt opposition was marginal. That changed in 2011 and 2012, when the largest anti-government protests since the Soviet collapse erupted in response to allegations of electoral fraud in the parliamentary elections, which solidified a single-party system ruled by the United Russia Party. Protesters, mainly from Russia's growing urban middle class, took to the streets demanding free elections and an end to Putin's rule. Initially, the regime tolerated the protests under the so-called tan democracy of Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, who was president at the time. However, after Putin was re-elected as president in 2012, the crackdown began. The government passed draconian laws restricting public assembly, labeled NGOs receiving foreign funding as foreign agents, and used harassment, arrests, and propaganda to discredit opposition leaders. That marked the definitive end to Russia's managed democracy, or sovereign democracy, as the Kremlin often described it at the time. After 2012, elections became mere formalities, and meaningful opposition was no longer permitted. So, fourth lesson is civil society and independent media are democracy's strongest defenders. Once they are dismantled, political opposition becomes practically impossible, and authoritarian consolidation accelerates. Fifth, and I'll try to skip over these next few because they're more contemporary, but also because I think we're running out of time. So in 2014, we had the annexation of Crimea, which was a turning point not just in Russia's foreign policy, but also its domestic politics. Putin seized on nationalist sentiment to justify invading and annexing Crimea after Ukraine's Maidan revolution. And that was widely popular in Russia. Putin's approval ratings soared to above 80%, and nationalist fervor was stoked. At the same time, the Kremlin's rhetoric became more aggressive internally. Critics of the government were labeled traitors, independent journalists were silenced, and repression again intensified. We also saw the war in eastern Ukraine, which again fueled tightened political control. So lesson 5 is nationalism can be a powerful tool for authoritarian leaders, allowing them to rally support, deflect blame, and justify crackdowns on dissent. When external threats are emphasized, domestic repression often follows. Sixth, in 2020, the Kremlin orchestrated a sweeping constitutional reform that effectively ensured Putin would remain in power until at least 2036. Among the changes included resetting presidential term limits, allowing Putin to ignore previous restrictions, strengthening presidential control over the judiciary and regional governments, embedding nationalist and conservative values into law, and to reinforce regime legitimacy. That sparked the legal culmination of Putin's authoritarian project. He was no longer what some experts call a spin dictator, having to sway public opinion and manipulate elections. He had rewritten the Constitution itself to ensure his indefinite rule, and Russia was now a personalist autocracy. Lesson 6 is Once legal and constitutional structures are changed to benefit a single leader, authoritarian rule becomes deeply entrenched. And finally, we get to today. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine has pushed Russia into its most repressive stage yet. Wartime censorship laws criminalized anti-war speech. Opposition leaders were jailed or exiled or in some cases killed, as in the case of Alexei Navalny. And even small acts of dissent, like displaying a blank piece of paper in protest, lead to arrest. The war has also driven the militarization of society, with conscription expanded and propaganda, framing the conflict as an existential struggle against the West. Russia has now become a fully consolidated dictatorship where the state controls nearly every aspect of political and social life. So we've gone from a budding democracy to a full-scale authoritarian system. And so the seventh lesson is, war often accelerates authoritarianism as leaders use external conflict to justify domestic repression. Once a regime relies on war for legitimacy, reversing course becomes increasingly difficult. And so that puts into question the negotiations that are happening today around Russia and Ukraine. And so I will leave it at that. I think there are many questions as to why ultimately democracy failed in Russia. Where was the point of no return? Russia's slide into authoritarianism, I think, was neither immediate nor inevitable. It was the product of constitutional weaknesses, economic dependencies, elite self-interest, and calculated repression. But of course, that story is not unique. Around the world, we see similar patterns of democratic backsliding, and I think that defending democratic institutions comes down to constant vigilance, active public participation, and a commitment to accountability and transparency. If we ignore these lessons, we risk following a similar path, wherever we may be.
Thank you for that. On these questions that you just posed, they don't want to spoil the discussion, and apply to the different contexts. Later on, I'm pleased to introduce as well Mr. Freddy Guevara Cortez, a Venezuelan political leader and current democracy visiting fellow at Harvard's Ash Center, who co-founded the progressive party Voluntad Popular. He has served as the vice president of Venezuela's parliament and has been a prominent figure in nonviolent civil uprisings against authoritarianism, enduring political persecution for his activism.
Thank you very much. Also very pleased and honored to share this amazing panel. It was amazing hearing you because the story of Venezuela looks very similar. I hope that we don't engage in the war part, but it's kind of like, well, and it's not only Venezuela and Russia. You will see that there's a lot of similar situations between a lot of autocratic processes. And I was hearing you was reminding, okay, so you have like this erosion that comes at a big cost, and that creates this discussion about it. Not neither democracy or autocracy is a black and white discussion. So instead of talking necessarily just about Venezuela, my experience there, I want to focus on some things. The first thing that I want to mention is like, why is it important, and at the same time, why it's dangerous to assume this grayscale or slow process and non-black and white discussion between democracy and autocracy. So why is it important? Well, because it's not the same to improve democracy than to protect democracy that is in democratic backsliding, than to try to recover democracy when you are in a competitive authoritarianism, and of course it's not the same as fighting to recover your freedom and basic rights when you are in a full autocracy. So that's important, right? And we need to understand that it's not the same. And we need, as a doctor, it's important to be aware of what is the diagnosis of the disease. It's important that politicians, policymakers, strategists, academia, journalists, understanding which stage that you are. Because you can underestimate the phase where you are, but you can also overreact. And both things can be bad. If you underestimate, well, I think the conclusion is logic. But also, you can start thinking that you are already in a phase of full autocracy when you still have other tools and you lose the capacity to act upon them. Or you can backfire. For example, this is an opinion of a Venezuelan that not many Venezuelans will agree on. But seeing our history in the back, I feel that, for example, there was a measure that we took in 2002 when Chavez was president, not a democratic president, but elected president, and the conclusion of that struggle ended up in a coup d'etat that took him out of power for so many days. That, looking in retrospective, in my opinion, we could have waited some years and do a recall referendum that had on the constitution, right? I'm not a fan at all of Chavez. I hate that guy with all my life. I oppose him since he was a kid. But what I'm saying is that, in retrospective, I can see that we acted in some ways that were a little bit ahead of the time. And with those type of things, you can create also, backfire. So it's very important to understand in which state you are. Because most of the time, and that's the very important thing that are confirmed in a new book that is called When Democracy Breaks. It's a compilation of different studies. Like most autocracies now are like this type of autocracies, and in Venezuela and many of them. It's like it comes from electoral leaders that are elected by the people. So democracy starts from within. So it's not the same. You don't have the same legitimacy, or not every action has the same legitimacy to confront an electoral authoritarian than if you have a full autocrat, right? So it's important. It's important to understand that this is a scale in order to address what is the right strategy to confront. But at the same time, it's dangerous. And why it's dangerous? Because then you can relativize this discussion, right? And then you can be unclear what is the line that defines one thing or the other. I don't want to undermine the discussion about improving democracy, but sometimes for people like me that come from an autocratic country, it's kind of hurtful when we hear people from the United States and other Western countries, we don't live in a democracy because the power of the corporations. Okay, I understand that discussion, and it's important, but it kind of relativizes the discussion of what is democracy or not. So every society has the right to improve their democracy, but at the same time, and understanding that you always can move forward, but it's important to find a threshold. And for me, I define the threshold in the Schumpeter's, definition. Like the minimal democracy of, you have to have at least free and fair elections in which at least two competitors, contest power. For me, that's the line. Below that line, you are not a democracy anymore. Above that line, it doesn't mean that you are a full democracy. You can have, competitive authoritarianism. You can have, just electoral democracy. You can have many issues, right? But I think it's important to address that you have to have a clear line. And that line is important not only for you within the country, but also for the international community. For example, when you regard, many people here don't know what the OAS means. It's the Organization of American States. It's not as important in the United States, but in the rest of the continent, it's kind of means something. And they have like a charter of democracy. There is a charter that doesn't serve at all because it was just designed to react to coup d'etats, like the traditional form of autocracy. A military goes and puts a gun against a president and they take him out. That doesn't work anymore, right? So we need to adapt and understand that this process, and that's the danger that I wanted to mention, is like, if you don't have this clear line and you just assume that it's very hard to react, and sometimes it's too late. Sometimes it's too late for the population, but sometimes also it's too late for an international community too. So I will conclude saying that we are in a moment of changes. As very recently, Freedom House just released, I think yesterday or today, a report that says that practically 80% of the population now lives in non-freedom societies. You have latest Erika Chenoweth's study, the professor that I work with, refers that the decrease in the success rate of democratization movements have declined increasingly. In the last years, just 2 pro-democracy movements has managed to, recover democracy: Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. All of them, you think about Venezuela, Belarus, Russia, Chad, South Sudan, Libya, Syria, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, and I can name many more. All of us have been failing. So there's a global problem, a systemic problem that's occurring, and we need to adapt. And the problem that, in addition to that, is like in a lot of democracies, the concept and the conviction and the appeal to democracy is also declining in several polls, but also you can see it in many ways in which societies, like people are freely electing autocratic leaders or autocratic parties. So we're in a very complicated situation that requires a lot of imagination, requires a lot of humility, understanding that the old frameworks doesn't necessarily work anymore, that none of us have the solution, and this is using Professor Haifiz's concept, this is an enacted challenge that will require that all the people that are thinking, researching, strategizing about this work together to find a solution and save many people's lives and rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guevara. I think we're starting to connect the lines and the themes and points together, which we'll eagerly then take on. Now I'm pleased to also introduce Nieman Fellow, Ms. Diana Duran Nunez, a Bogotá-based journalist who most recently served as a reporter for the TV news magazine Los Informantes on Caracol Televisión in Colombia. Ms. Duran Nunez has dedicated over 15 years to investigating human rights abuses, corruption, and internal conflicts, providing deep insights into the dynamics of democracy in Latin America, a place where journalism has now played a pivotal role. So let's welcome to the floor.
You hear me well? Yes. Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for being here, especially at this time. I know it's the end of the day. You're probably tired, so I'll try to keep it short for you. As Alejandro just said, I'm an Nieman Fellow, which means I'm a journalist, and I am very honored to be a journalist, despite how unpopular we are right now. And the reason I am still very proud to be a journalist is because I truly believe in how necessary our work is, especially to protect democracies. So a few days ago, I listened to one of our fellows say something that stuck in my head. He said, he said he wondered if the Watergate scandal happened today, if there would be any punishments like it happened in the 70s. And I think there wouldn't be. And that is terribly sad. And it says a lot about the kind of society we are right now, we are nowadays. Because of this excessive flow of information we all have access to 24/7, I'm sure there would be videos, a lot of videos, and there would be a lot of controversy, but in the end, the truth wouldn't matter enough so that there would be consequences on something as big as the Watergate scandal. And I think the reason why is because as there is we see a lot of fatigue on the information, on the excessive information amount that we have access to. This goes hand in hand with a different problem that stems from our political leaders, that is denial and resignification, and that's what we're seeing a lot. So political leaders, I think, have learned how to hold on to power, have learned that very, very well with, like, as years pass by. And mainly they have learned how to lie to all of us. And people no longer want the truth, which is, for me, what worries me the most, because my work is to tell people the truth. But if people don't want it, then what's the whole point in it? So my own perception on what is going on is that instead of the truth, people want leaders that they can share values with. And that is very dangerous for any society, because when that happens, we lose our capacity to be critic towards those who lead us. And we don't care. Trump has been in power like 6 weeks, right? 6, 7 weeks? 5? So in 5 weeks, the US society has been lied over and over. And it's amazing, no, it's not amazing, it's striking how they can get away with it. Despite the fact that the information, the real information about what they're saying is actually out there. Like, it's not even hidden, it's there. And it's accessible to anyone who wants to find it. So these practices of denial and resignification, I think, are a huge challenge for our democracies, for people as citizens and for us as journalists, because it is becoming much more difficult to hold the public powers accountable due to the lack of transparency. And it might also explain why journalists are being labeled as enemies. I understand very well that there are many journalists and many media outlets whose practices are at least questionable, but let's assume that I'm talking about good ethical journalism. And for us, truth is a purpose, it's a life purpose. But the places when we can't do our work and we're attacked for what we do, that is a huge sign, like a huge alert that any society should take into account. And we have a lot of examples in Latin America. We have Venezuela, we have Nicaragua, for a long time Ecuador. They passed a lot of bills trying to pretty much cut the freedom of the press, and we've seen that in many other countries. And now the US goes into this list. And it's very concerning, it's very upsetting, because we, like people who are outside, like people like me who come from abroad, we always relied on the values that the US government shared with the world. Even though we knew, of course, we're not naive, we knew there was a huge agenda behind it, economic interests, and so on, and a lot of questionable methods. But the fact that the US democracy might be at risk puts us all at risk. And denial and resignification are a huge challenge for citizens too, because it points to an essential question, and it's where and how are we getting information from, and what do we want to do with it? So, denial and resignification allow authoritarian governments to cross red lines, while at the same time they're saying, no, we're not. We're not crossing that red line you think we're crossing. And every society must wonder what are the risks of that happening. So good journalism is necessary because it highlights every time a red line has been breached. But the truth is, we as journalists cannot achieve anything at all if we are not legitimate to the people we are working for. And we see that happening now. So these are like the remarks that I wanted to bring for you, hopefully to open a larger discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Duran. You're absolutely right. We believe journalism is playing currently a pivotal and crucial role in the making and the fighting for democracy. And that is the reason why I'm also pleased to introduce also Nieman Fellow, Ms. Lina Chawaf, the CEO of Radio Rozana, an independent Syrian media network. With extensive experience in media and press freedom, Ms. Chawaf also profound understanding of the challenges faced by journalists in regions where democratic values are under siege. So let's welcome Ms. Chawaf.
Thanks. So, I'll start, I'm Syrian journalist, but I'll start from USA. I think we have to start from here because we have, I think a lot of us ask ourselves why people vote for Trump. Like, we have have this question in our mind all the time, why people really vote for Trump. If we are human beings who support democracy and believe in it, we have to stand with ourselves and ask why we lost in the last election. Here in USA, it should be the loudest country in calling for democracy. Maybe because as Democrats in the world, and not only in the USA, by the way, I'm gonna connect all this with Syria, we didn't stuck to our value, that we have been calling for it and fighting for it since the beginning. We betrayed the people who believe in us, who tried to follow our step. How? You will ask me how we betrayed people. I'll tell you the story of the Syrian people as an example of a population who revolted for those values, thinking that they will be really supported by their alliance and by their symbol in freedom and democracy in the other big country. What happened that as Syrian, we rose up against injustice and tyranny, aspiring for democracy and freedom, and following in the footsteps of developed countries like USA. We were screaming and writing on the wall in Syria, 2011, we want freedom and democracy. We were screaming very loud. But what happened really, that United States of America, represented by Obama, said that the chemical weapon in Syria is red line. Then, August 2013, rockets containing sarin gas were used to attack opposition-controlled area in suburb of Damascus. 1,600 civilians killed in one night. In 2017, another chemical attack on Idlib, mid of Syria. April 2018, a helicopter delivered with chlorine-filled gas cylinder to a residential apartment building in suburb of Damascus again. Who moved for this Syrian innocent? Who died under those attacks? Nobody moved. Who stood for them? Where is the USA that they said it's red line? Why the Democrat represented by Obama didn't stick to their word? All this question push not only the Syrian, but also the whole population in the world to not trust the Democrat anymore. They are devastated and frustrated, so this is why we find now that the far right, the right wing, is rising to the surface more and more all over the world. I remember from the first moment of what has been started happening in Syria, and the reaction of the international community. I have telling all the foreign journalists and the politicians and all the decision makers in the world, I was telling them that what is happening in Syria, it won't stay there. The impact will spread and reach all the countries in the world, and especially the big countries who are involved in the Syrian case. Because they're thinking that it's in Syria and it will stay in Syria. I think this is the answer of the question that turn in our head nowadays. Now the story after Assad fall is, Assad is the ex-regime in Syria, who doesn't know who is Assad. Now after Assad fall, it's another kind of story. Let me tell you. Syrians have been struggling for this moment since 2011, and after they lost all the hope to reach it, something happened, and HTS, a group part of Al-Qaeda, if you know, took over the country. I'm running a Syrian media independent since 2013 till now. And as I wrote in many articles here in USA, I wrote for Boston Globe, for Washington Post after Assad fall, that we are happy for sure. But at the same time, we are happy because the most brutal dictator in the world failed. But we are worried at the same time. Because those HTS, the group of part of Al-Qaeda, they don't believe in freedom or democracy too. We know this. Those words that I wrote made some Syrian educated one angry, attacked me, and they start to blame me for my word. I answered them that this was the first demand in our revolution. We were screaming and writing on the wall, freedom and democracy. They start to write on the public social media page of Rozana Media that I run, something like, we know that you don't want them because they are Islam. You want to be back to the secular regime, we know you. My answer was through professional content, saying that I don't mind any party taking over the country, but they should come through election. That is what we pay the price for all this last 54 years. We pay a huge price for democracy. So let's practice it after all this. Let's feel that our voice means something, that we have a voice in our country. But we find that some Syrians really don't believe in democracy anymore because, as I said in the beginning, they can no longer trust the Democrat. So the big question now, did we lost our battle for democracy because of them or because of us? And how we can bring democracy again from the brink.
I think it's very insightful hearing you, and I'm very eager to be able to introduce these in our discussion. And lastly, but not least at all, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Peter Levine, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tufts University's Tisch College. Professor Levine specializes in political theory, American politics, and civic studies, and extensive research which explores the role of civic engagement in sustaining democratic societies. So, I'll give you the floor to Mr. Peter Levine.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being here. And I will be actually least as well as last because I don't want to add too much. And I won't take long because we should get to conversation. But I thought I'd really uplift a few things that I've heard, most of which I wanted to mention anyway. So thank you to my colleagues for raising these. And maybe throw in one quick thought. Things that I find concerning and interesting in the conversation. One is the word oligarch has been mentioned a lot, going back also to Ambassador Chaddock's talk. And that's, in fact, you could, on the really great logo up here, could say democracy, autocracy, and oligarchy, except that wouldn't quite work. I'm not precisely sure what an oligarch is or if we all agree, but I think it's often a person with a lot of individual personal wealth, so it's not a corporation, which corporations have their own challenges, but it's not a corporation. And it's somebody with a lot of personal wealth who is close to, or actually running, a political system or a media empire. And so when we look at this country, we have a billionaire president with a sidekick who has $1/3 trillion and a major newspaper that belongs to the second or third richest person in the world. But there are about 2,500 billionaires on the earth right now, and quite a few of them are connected to politics. I think, I just tried to look this up, and I think about 13 countries have been led by a billionaire within the last 10 years. And that's not even counting the people who are connected to different politics. And it's not counting the UK because Rishi Sunak only has 850 million. But this is I don't think it's a completely new phenomenon after all the word is 2,000 years old, and there have been very rich people close to politics in different countries around the world at different times, but it seems like an acute problem and something much more dramatic than it has been before. The second point is, I think there's a tool, this has been mentioned by several of my colleagues, there's a toolkit for the contemporary authoritarian that's quite effective. There's also a toolkit for the bottom-up democratic movement that is currently not as effective. Well, I give all honor and credit to people who use the toolkit, and so many of whom have died trying. It's not working as well. So, and there seems to me there's some oscillation. It's a kind of cat and mouse game. So in the period that when John Chaddock was first becoming well known internationally, the period in the late 80s and 90s, a whole bunch of regimes, authoritarian regimes, fell across the world, right? And they were quite heterogeneous, right-wing, left-wing. And they tended to fall to people power of some kind or other. And one diagnosis for that would be that their toolkit, the autocrat's toolkit, was very old-fashioned, mid-20th century, out of date, and not very effective. And on the other hand, that the people power movements had some really powerful new tools that fit with the media environments and the social structures of the society, some of which had come out of the American Civil Rights Movement. And so they had a great track record. But I think that this has oscillated now, so that most of the innovation actually and the very clever ideas and the sophistication is on the autocrat side. And it's interesting the way it crosses ideology. So they don't have to be allies to learn from each other, they just keep an eye on each other. So you can have regimes that on paper you would think would be quite diverse or even opposed, borrowing each other's toolkits. So that's the second point I want to make. The third point is presidents and heads of powerful executives are a particular problem. I've never been one who thought that there was a great, perfect constitutional design that would preserve a democracy, that it was all about the Constitution, nor that there was necessarily a fatal flaw to any particular constitution. But I must say there's a pattern here where, and not a perfect pattern, so I'll get to that in a second, but there's a lot of strong presidential systems which have been turned to strict autocracies. And, well, I mean, among the exceptions, Hungary, I think, had a parliamentary system that Orban just cut to control. And there's a tradition to that. That's what Mussolini did. But a lot of these are presidential republics, and I think that's worrying. The Spanish political scientist, though he ended up in America, Leibniz thought that really no presidential republic had survived except the U.S. And for reasons I think ours is now failing. All those things I think were said by other people, at least hinted at. The last thing I wanted to say is kind of a little bit of a pet theory, but I think it's at least interesting, which is that in the at least in the developed world, but also in Latin America, in parts of Latin America, the right is getting the autocratic right is getting its strongest electoral support from working class people, and the center left is often getting the strongest support from the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And it's not true every time, but I looked at 120 recent elections, and it's a pattern over all of them. And we just saw it with Germany, where the AfD, the right wing, has got a very strong working class base, and the most upscale part of the electorate went for the Greens, sort of center left. And this, I'll just say, I think this is also reminiscent of the 1930s, and it is worrying for the following reason. Of course, it goes to the question of why did people vote for Trump, because you could generalize it to why did working class people vote for autocrat. And the reason that it really alarms me is because if the conservative party is supported by the wealthy, then the natural thing for that group of groups to do will be to try to cut government, cut taxes, cut regulation. And that's not my choice, that's not how I vote. But it's sort of, it's controllable and it's part of the democratic process. They're arguing for cutting taxes, they can argue for cutting taxes. And meanwhile, if the left is supported by working class people, then it will argue for more welfare, more support, and that also is something that democracy can offer. But if it switches, the right can't offer tax cuts because poorer people don't pay many taxes. In the United States, about 50% of the population doesn't pay federal income taxes. So they can't offer that, and so what they're normally going to offer is something like ethno-nationalism or autocracy. And on the other hand, the left, if it's supported as in really the Democratic Party here, but certainly in their case would be Germany, by people who are upscale, it's not going to do anything to address the real challenges of working class people. It's going to be divorced from their challenges, not really going to care. Most of the politics is going to be performative. And that's going to build the resentment that John Chaddock talked about. So we got to switch that. So I there's some areas of hope. One is this toolkit problem of the bad guys having the good toolkit and the good guys having a weak toolkit will switch, because innovation is now going to have to go the other way. And I'm confident it'll happen. I don't know if it'll happen very fast, but the innovation is going to come from the bottom up. And the second thing is the class inversion can be addressed by actually organizing and listening to and working with working class people.
And so, I think we can all draw so many elements from all these remarks that we've heard. Just recently, as you said, from oligarchy, the role of journalism, the role of the people, the lines that we use to draw where we alter into a democracy, but then the fact that these may not be universal lines. So, for the interest of time, for the interest of discussion, I just want to make just one big general question that please, whoever wants to start, and then whoever wants to then reply is more than encouraged to do so. If democracy then is constantly evolving, as we have seen historically and we see now, then what does its future look like? Are we witnessing its reinvention, a shift to new forms of governance, slow descent into something else? And what elements that you all have drawn do you think will play part into this new reimagination of what democracy is? So whoever wants to start, give the floor.
Well, I can just say a few words and react to some of the things that my colleagues have said. One of the things that really resonated with me is the argument that political leaders are increasingly turning to lying to stay in power as opposed to repression. And for a long time, that was in fact the case in Russia as well. I mentioned the idea of spin dictators, and the term post-truth world was very popular. Propaganda in Russia, at least, was seen not always as persuasion, but rather kind of a fire hose of falsehoods. And disinformation was a combination of truths, half-truths, and lies. There was always some kind of kernel of truth in the propaganda. And the idea was sort of flooding the zone with information, and yes, that stoked nationalist, conservative, illiberal values, but also what it did was demobilize the public, generate confusion and apathy. And I think many authoritarian regimes have been using that strategy to their advantage. It was mentioned already that it's not entirely certain what the future of people power will be. And if you may remember, the last thing I mentioned is that democracy is only as strong as the willingness of its people to defend it. And so when I look at the region of the world I study, which is the post-Soviet space, Eurasia, I see that there's a mixed track record when it comes to people power. On the one hand, there were successful so-called color revolutions in countries like Ukraine in 2004, Georgia 2003, Kyrgyzstan 2005, all of those, by the way, before the Arab Spring of 2010 to 2012, and after which authoritarian regimes learned how to manipulate the information landscape online. And social media for a long time was praised as this kind of vehicle of democracy promotion. And it turned out that's not entirely true. Are we going to see artificial intelligence now as a new kind of democratic promotion vehicle? And of course, authoritarian countries learned to repress protests. But we still saw in Armenia in 2018, the Velvet Revolution, and some of the attempted revolutions failed. In 2011 and 2012, I already mentioned Russia. In 2020, the protests in Belarus were unsuccessful. And most recently in 2022 in Kazakhstan. Those are just several examples I can think of. I'm sure you can think of others. But that just goes to show that the future of people power is unclear, and we'll see what happens in the coming years.
No, I was of course, the future of democracy, how should it look, depends on in which state you are, right? So for people like me and my people, the future of democracy, at least you want to be able to choose, right? But I think that in general sense, I think that's part of what you were saying, and also you were talking about it in the international sphere, but I think it also reflects here is how democracies and how representative democracy becomes more responsive to the people, right? And I think that's the cue. And I think that technology can be very harmful, but also very useful, because now there's a lot of ways in which many elements of deliberative democracy that before were kind of very theoretical and hard to apply, now you have many ways to incorporate the, and use AI to try to categorize what people really think, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity and beauty in the capacity to transform AI in a tool to gather and try to understand more information, even if you're a mayor or a congressman. And then a lot of people rise to you. The amount of time that you have to do to classify the information, it's complicated, right? So maybe you can become more responsive and be more aligned to what people want if you are more able to read better the room. So, which is going to be the way, probably there's no one single recipe. And each society will have to decide, because there's not the values of the Scandinavians is different than Americans, Latin Americans, a lot of things differs. But I think how to say, like the compass guides towards more responsiveness and more participation, and making people be more aligned with the process of feedback, and also being part of the process of the decision making itself. So I don't say necessarily direct democracy, but at least a more participatory democracy.
So I would say that, as Freddy has just said, the civic participation is essential to any kind of democracy. And speaking again from my profession, I think for journalism, as like I just said, for journalism to be a good shield for democracies, right now we face the huge challenge to pretty much reinvent ourselves. And I think the challenges that all democratic countries with kind of backslides are facing now, they are pushing us, journalists, to also face challenges in order to continue being helpful to our societies. Because journalism cannot be seen like anything different than it is a social service. We exist for societies, for people to make better decisions in their daily lives. But there has to be a connection between the information we provide and the people who receive the information. And my perception right now is that that connection is very weak in many spaces. So we as journalists need to figure out new ways to strengthen those connections. Some years ago, colleagues around the world came up with, I thought it was a brilliant idea, about fact-checking, for instance, politicians. And what I see now is that that idea that was brilliant 10 years ago is no longer sufficient today. So we have to do something more than that. What? I wish I knew. That is the million-dollar question for us right now. In our whole program, we're 24 journalists from around the world, and we keep asking ourselves these questions because it's not easy. But we do realize that the connections are weaker and that we need to keep them strong in order to continue being a valuable asset to societies.
I'll continue from there. So I think journalism has to be the tools of accountability on the politician region and all like diversity in the world. You know, this is very important. And according to your question and what you talk about, that like civil society organization and media independent is very very important tools to build democracy. And this is why when any authority or any taking over the country like Syria, and I'm just talking from my experience, like they first of all they run to the media and civil society organization. They want to control it because they know they're playing a very powerful role. And I think for democracy, I think we have just to believe in the value and go for it. If we say something and do something, this is where we betrayed ourselves and the other.
You went down the road again, and we'll do it. I'm happy to do that. I want to say really two words, innovation and then rebuilding. So I think, I imagine that your conversation in the Neiman Fellows is probably pretty stressful. I don't know, I shouldn't speak for you, but maybe stressful. There's there's an understanding that things aren't working, the processes, things like fact-checking aren't working. There's a need to innovate, and there's human lives at stake. And so this is very difficult. But I also think those conversations are happening by very creative people all over the world, and innovation is going to come out of it. And there's going to be more effective methods. Maybe not, but I'm cautiously optimistic. And then the other thing is that when the tide turns, there's going to be a need for different kinds of rebuilding. I won't talk about the whole world because I have no business doing that, but if you're a young American, I think you're going to be part of rebuilding. Maybe not fast enough, and maybe the damage will be very severe, but I think you're going to be part of rebuilding. So my generational perspective for people in our classrooms here at Tufts is mostly highly optimistic. I think going to be a generation that rebuilds. Whether that is in 3 years or 8 years or possibly quicker, I don't know. But innovation comes first because that's how you have to win, and then reconstruction would be another word.
Thank you very much. And I think I'd like to thank all of you because these questions are not supposed to be straightforward and they're complex. They're not, because at the same time that each and every context plays a vital role, and you can tell that every single region has a specific way of dealing with a specific approach. At the same time, all the others play a factor into in this globalization and this globalized society that we're in. So thank you very much for the insights of what this could be. And with that, I just want to encourage then all of you in the public to think of these elements as well. And now I'll put it up to you. So we want to encourage you to ask some questions.